Hey everyone, in today's episode, I will discuss the cheapest suburbs worth buying in Melbourne. Melbourne happens to be my favourite place to invest at the moment, and that's against basically all the media, every buyer's agent in the country, and every almost, should I say, property professional there is in the country, and there's a very simple reason for that. Property, in my eyes, is a long term game, and it's a game where you should be buying for at least 20 years or more. So you need to really take into consideration what has happened in the long term and what will happen in the long term. Now, Melbourne, don't get me wrong, has been run by an absolute clown show down there in terms of governance for the last about 8 or so years, but it is actually Australia's best performing city long term. So let's get into this episode. Now, to identify the best performing suburbs worth buying in Melbourne, we need to identify the best performing regions. Now, Melbourne's good because it's got a lot of these regions that are very good, and I'm going to give two suburbs for each of them. They are the inner city, the inner east, the inner west, the inner south and southeast, and the Bayside. I've also included one suburb that's actually from a smaller region that is very good performing, and that's the inner north of Melbourne. Now, Melbourne is one of the most expensive cities in Australia and the world. So, look, the minimum purchase price you're really looking at in Melbourne is $750,000. Now, this is region dependent, and you won't find this in somewhere like the inner east or inner south because they are quite expensive regions. But there are some suburbs that I will mention here that you can pick up for $750,000. So, just keep your eye out for that. And yeah, a lot of them will need a bit of work, so just keep that in mind too. The driving factors behind Melbourne's growth are quite similar to Sydney in a way. So they are, number one, the demographics, so where the wealthy live. Number two, the access to high-paying jobs, so where the high-paying jobs are, particularly white-collar jobs, because Melbourne is very much so a white-collar city. Three, business demand, so that does combine with the high-paying jobs. Four, the lifestyle triangle, which is the time it takes to go from work to school to home and lifestyle regions and back. Another one's school zones, so that's number five, are really important. A lot of these areas have shown growth for more than 50 years in great school zone regions, so just keep that in consideration. And then also 6 and 7 is a restriction of supply combined with excess demand from a wealthy demographic. That's really key in somewhere like Melbourne. So places like Melbourne, should I say, are no different really to other parts of Australia. And why am I saying that? Look, the reason I'm saying that is cheap doesn't necessarily mean good performing. So I've got an active example here of somewhere called Werribee and then somewhere called Footscray. So the two suburbs that are basically west of Melbourne CBD, one is about 6Ks, the other is about 50 or so or more. It's a long way out of Melbourne, and it's actually a pretty common place for a lot of buyers agents and investors to go, but it's an absolutely terrible location to buy. So here's an actual image of prices in both Footscray and Werribee in the early 1990s, or should I say the turn of the 90s. Now you'll see here they're actually almost exactly similarly priced. So they're priced both around the $90,000 to $100,000, which is really interesting because back then that would have been a lot of money. But then you take it to today, and you can see here that Werribee's it's about, look, to be fair, it's about mid 500s to 600,000. That's roughly its price. And Footscray's sort of around the $920,000 to $950,000 range. So look, it's about 80% more expensive than it today. But imagine you had to listen to someone who told you to buy in, let's say, Werribee, right, rather than Footscray, just because you got higher yield. And then today, Werribee, you'll get around maybe $380 to $400 a week. Footscray, you'll probably get $600 to maybe $650 a week. So you're outdoing it on both growth and also cash flow today, just simply because it's such a good suburb to buy in. So don't listen to that rubbish rhetoric. Anyway, let's get into it. Let's start with Melbourne's inner city. The first suburb I'm actually going to is a suburb called Collingwood. So it's probably most famous for being the home of the Pies, so Collingwood Football Club, but it's actually quite a good suburb to buy in. Now, the reason for this is it's because it's so close to the CBD, number one. It's actually only about 3Ks away from the Melbourne CBD. Look, it is known for having the public housing towers in it, but rest assured, just think of it similar to Redfern in Sydney or somewhere maybe like West End in Brisbane that's done very well over the long term. Collingwood's no different to that. So look, a thing about Collingwood, despite having quite a lot of public housing in it, is that you've actually got a super high median income in Collingwood. So if you look at the ABS in 2021, you'll see that the median weekly household income is $2,130 a week. And then the median mortgage repayment's only $2,167 a week, which is interesting because for a suburb that has a lot of public housing, they actually count towards the census too. So a lot of them would be earning, I'd say, less than $500 a week in most circumstances. So that would be pulling this average down. So your real average median weekly household income is probably closer to $3,000 because they would completely shroud that number and average it down, or not average it, but should they say bring that median down. So that's something you can consider in Collingwood. Look, the suburb as well is completely built. You've got some beautiful old terraces there, not only terraces, but also detached kind of miners' cottages and Victorian cottages. They're great buys, mind you, and you actually get fairly good rent there for the moment. So look, in Collingwood, you can purchase for around $1 million or so, and then you usually get somewhere about $700 to $800 a week in rent. So you can literally pick up, like I'd say, around 4% yield in Collingwood, no problems, which is actually really rare for Melbourne. Usually these suburbs that are above $1 million usually only yield about 2.8 to about 3.2% in Melbourne. That's pretty common. So something to consider most definitely, and it will continue to gentrify in the future. Look, another suburb in Melbourne, in a city that I really like, is a suburb called Cron. Now, for those who don't know where Cron is, it's basically a suburb of Richmond in Melbourne, but it's the small pocket that's basically down to the south of Richmond. It's actually technically the southern sort of western pocket of Richmond, and it's right next to basically your MCG precinct. So Cron is actually one of the wealthiest suburbs in all of Melbourne. It actually has the second highest median income, only second to Kooyong, which is actually right just really across the Yarra technically. So looking at median household weekly income in Cron is $2,959, and then your monthly mortgage repayments are only $2,300, which is really interesting because that a week is roughly nearly $700 more than your monthly mortgage repayment. So people here have an excess of savings and money that they can spend on their mortgages, granted to what their houses are actually worth and what their actual mortgages are worth too. So it's not only that too, but when considering both Cron and Collingwood, you got to consider where rent can go to, because look, 30% of basically your weekly income is considered what is a healthy amount to service for rent, right? So look, 30% of $2,959 is what, roughly $900 or so, and the rent at the moment in Cremon's only about $750. So there's plenty of room for both capital growth here and rental growth because of the amount of income coming into the suburb. So it's definitely something to consider when looking at buying Cron, a really good suburb, and easily for me a top 20 suburb in Australia to buy in. So definitely consider Cron when looking to buy in Melbourne. Let's get into the inner east of Melbourne. So look, the inner east is very much so an old money area of Melbourne. You got areas especially like Hawthorn, Canterbury, Camberwell that are, I'd say, some of the historically most wealthy suburbs of Melbourne. You got heritage blocks, heritage homes on acreage blocks, especially towards Hawthorn and Camberwell. Some of these can sell for $10 million or more, which is just incredible. But a suburb nearby that I actually think is very underpriced is a suburb called Mont Albert North. So for those that don't know where it is, it's basically straight north of Surrey Hills. Look, it's only about 2 k's north of that. You got Mont Albert just south of it. Mont Albert North occupying the top pocket of the suburb there, or should I say top pocket just before Doncaster there. Anyway, but Mont Albert is actually placed in amongst some of the best schools in all of Melbourne. So nearby you have, Camberwell Girls Grammar, you've got Scotch College, you've got St Catherine's, Melbourne Grammar School's not overly far away either. Really popular amongst, I guess, a lot of the Asian community as well, a lot of wealthy Asian buyers too. Old money area and historically a very good performer. You'll see it in the top 100 suburbs of the Aussie Home Loans 25-year report. It quite regularly over the long term will place there. It generally doesn't set the world alight for 1 year, but it will perform very well over the course of a lot of years, and then it won't go down in much value when the market comes down. So that's why over the long term it actually performs very well. Look, another suburb in the inner east of Melbourne that you should consider is a suburb called Ashburton. So for those that don't know where Ashburton is, it's basically wedged between both Glen Iris and Malvern East. So look, both of those suburbs are, I'd say, definitely upper middle class suburbs in Melbourne. Also quite expensive. You do have some very large homes selling for above $5 million in both of them. Again, close to all your really good private schools. Also actually close to the Bayside as well. So you actually, if you consider your lifestyle precinct or lifestyle triangle, Ashburton's really good because it's close to, your job hubs of, should I say, South Bank, your law precinct of Kew, your actual, should I say, banking precinct of the CBD, but then it's also close to, Centre Road and Bentley East. It's close to South Yarra, Prahran, and all the shops around there. It's close to Elwood and the Bayside as well. So really good place in terms of your lifestyle triangle, and you can still pick up homes in Ashburton for 1.8 million bucks, so well under the $2 million mark. When you got Glen Iris's home selling for like 2.6 or more quite regularly, so very cheap for the suburb that it's in and the region that it's in Melbourne. Now to one of my favourite regions of Melbourne, and that's the inner west of Melbourne. So a suburb that I'm going to that I think is actually very underpriced is a suburb called Yarraville in Melbourne. So Yarraville's in the Maribyrnong Council region, and it sits about 6 to 8 k's away from the CBD, depending on where you are in the suburb. But the thing about Yarraville is it has an unbelievably good median income. Is to one thing. So Yarraville's median income is literally $2,485 a week. Now, what I say to a lot of people is Yarraville is Marrickville 10 years ago, because Melbourne is about one property cycle behind Sydney in general, right? And 10 years ago, Marrickville didn't have this median income, but it was similarly priced to Yarraville. So this median income here is just incredible for what Yarraville has, and it's also the price point because you're picking up properties in Yarraville, detached homes I'm talking, still at a flat $1 million or maybe slightly over, which is just an incredible number. And not only that too, but you've also got a really good village in Yarraville. It's well known all over Melbourne as one of the most trendy and, should I say, popular lifestyle precincts in the region. So look, definitely consider Yarraville. It's such a good suburb to buy in and one of my favourites, and definitely one I'm looking at very hard. Another suburb in the inner west that I'm looking at is a suburb called Braybrook. Now, it will come to a lot of surprises, I guess, for a lot of people with me saying this, but Braybrook's gone through a thing called rejuvenation recently. So I remember in recent episodes quoting that there is a difference between rejuvenation and gentrification, and generally rejuvenation becomes first before gentrification. Now, the thing with Braybrook is that basically the suburb has rejuvenated, and it's actually known by many people from Melbourne as the Bronx of Melbourne, because pre-2006 the suburb had about 63% or more of housing commission in it. So what's basically happened here is there's only around 23 to 24% of the suburb that has housing commission left in it, because most of it's been sold off, but that's continuing to happen as years go by. So you'll see a lot of public auctions out there, and that's actually old public housing blocks being sold off here. But another thing about Braybrook is it's actually a part of an urban renewal scheme for the Victorian government. So what's happening here is the Victorian government's actually got a regeneration project going on in Braybrook, and that's due to finish in the next two years or so. Obviously, the government can't run anything to plan in Victoria, but I won't get into that. But basically, regeneration projects all to do with basically rescaping and creating the suburb that they want it to be, because it only happens to sit about 10 k's away or so from the CBD. So it's an ideally located suburb, and it's actually along that sort of train line of Sunshine and also your West Footscray, depending on where you are in the suburb, and also Ballarat Road. So it's actually quite well located. And you've also, got your Central West Shopping Centre there, which has actually been redeveloped quite a bit, and it's actually looking a lot better than it used to in recent years. Look, comparing Braybrook to West Footscray, the price is so much cheaper as well. So, look, West Footscray is about $940,000 for a property, whereas Braybrook's only sort of in that low to mid 700s range. So it's a lot cheaper than neighbouring suburbs. So it's something to consider there. And look, if you've got a budget that, is, as I said, like around that $750,000, you can easily buy in a Braybrook. You can actually, for a bit of a bunged up property, even get a little bit cheaper. But for one that's, let's say, livable or rentable, Braybrook is a suburb in Victoria and Melbourne that you can buy and that has performed very well and will continue to do so. It's actually in Melbourne's top 20 suburbs in your Aussie Home Loans 25-year report. If you want to look at it, it's performed at nearly 10% for nearly 30 years. So consider that when you're looking to buy in the inner west of Melbourne. Braybrook, despite the old noise and the rhetoric, it is a really good suburb to buy in. Look, at another region that is also a really good region of Melbourne, probably my favourite lifestyle region of Melbourne, is your inner south and southeast. And look, you got some of the best suburbs here, such as Albert Park, Chirac, Middle Park, your most famous suburbs where everything's happening. Really good area to buy in as well. Just really expensive, that's the only issue. But the suburb that I'm going to look at here is Port Melbourne. So look, Port Melbourne is interesting because, don't get me wrong, it's not cheap. It's about $1.6 million or so. So it is expensive, 100%. It's not, I'm not saying it's a cheap suburb. But Port Melbourne actually is an interesting suburb in the sense that it's got both your, should I say, residential part and also your commercial pocket. It only sits about 2.5 k's from the CBD, which is incredible. But in recent decades, look, it used to be the place where basically all the wharfies used to stay in the dock hands, but it's really gentrified in recent years. So it's one of your few suburbs in Melbourne that you can't really upgrade from. So that's a key point I just want to make there. So look, Melbourne really, you've only really got, I'd say, probably Elwood to Port Melbourne and probably towards Chirac, that are suburbs that no one really moves from and they just stay put. So Port Melbourne's become one of them, and it's like easily one of Melbourne's best suburbs. Look, you got the CBD really close by. You've got, your Albert Park and Middle Park really close by, which is one of your most famous areas. You've got South Bank, the casino area. You've got Docklands just down the road. The MCG only about, I think, 7 or 8 minutes or so away. So it's such a good area to live. You've got the beachfront all over there. Pretty sure Dog Beach or Dog Component part of the beach as well. Really, really good area to live. And you're going to see places in Port Melbourne in the future, selling for, Chirac kind of prices today. So you see them selling for like, 8 million, 10 million, especially along that beachfront. Really good suburb to get into. It's going to be in 10 years. It's not going to be 1.6 million. It's going to be $3 million. So if you have that money and that's kind of a spot you want to buy, definitely consider Port Melbourne. Another suburb in the inner south or southeast of Melbourne that I really like is a suburb called Balaclava. And I'm not talking about the balaclava you put over your head. I'm talking about Balaclava, the suburb that's right next to St Kilda. So look, a thing about Balaclava that's really interesting, it's particularly Balaclava and St Kilda East actually, is the presence of the Jewish community there. It's really, really strong there. You got, Yeshiva College that is actually just there. It's really popular among Jewish people. A lot of synagogues quite close by as well. And look, the thing about the Jewish people is that they generally don't like investing in non-hard assets. So look, they generally like investing in property, gold and things like that because it's hard assets and it's just more what they believe in. Not only that too, but especially the religious sort of Jewish population too, what they'll generally do is on their actual days of religion, they won't actually use public transport or anything like that. They'll only walk. So they like being close to these places of worship. So Look, Balaclava actually in 2017 for a period had a clearance rate of 100%. Now that's really rare because that means anything, no matter how ridiculously priced it was, sold. So you could have a place that might be worth 1.6 million bucks, but it was, let's say, placed at 1.8 million as a reserve, and it's still sold. So that's something that goes on in Balaclava quite a lot. It's a suburb that's extremely tightly held, and it'll perform very well in the long term. So look, definitely consider Balaclava when looking at the inner east and southeast. You're still picking up properties in Balaclava for, 1.2 to 1.4 million. Again, that's probably not going to last too long. You're probably going to see that number, swelter right out to you. Look, in my opinion, probably that maybe even 2.5 to 2.8 million dollar mark in 10 years time. So definitely consider that into the future. Now to one of the most popular areas of Melbourne, also one of my favourites, and that's the Bayside of Melbourne. Look, the Bayside's probably best known for Brighton, the Golden Mile of Brighton, and especially its beach shacks along the frontage of Brighton. Easily one of the most photographed locations in all of Melbourne. But the suburb in the Bayside that I think is very underpriced is a suburb called Bentley. So Bentley's not only underpriced because of its neighbours being Brighton East, Ormond and McKinnon, but it's actually a really good suburb to buy in, specifically because of one of the school zones that part of the suburb sits in. So that is McKinnon Secondary College. Look, for those that aren't from Melbourne, McKinnon Secondary College is actually one of the best public school zones in all of Melbourne. And Bentley actually sits near a lot of really good private schools as well. But the part, particularly the suburb just north of Centre Road, is actually zoned for McKinnon Secondary College. So people literally go scrambling over and fighting each other over just houses in this pocket, which is, look, it's pretty incredible. So Bentley's a really cheap suburb, and you're still picking up properties in Bentley, around the $1.5 million mark. And I'm telling you right now, compared to especially its neighbours of Ormond and McKinnon, particularly if it's zoned for McKinnon, you're going to see these properties in probably 10 years worth, well over $2.5 million. And especially those that are on large family blocks zoned in that region are going to be really, really expensive and really good properties to hold long term, because it's only going to get fiercer and fiercer, the actual fighting over this actual location, because a lot of your wealthy people, your wealthy families, your developers, especially wealthy migrants, all want to live in here. So consider Bentley when buying in the Bayside of Melbourne. Another suburb that I really like in the Bayside of Melbourne is a suburb called Cheltenham. Look, Cheltenham's an interesting suburb because Cheltenham is a suburb that, isn't overly expensive. It's only a touch over $1 million, about 1.1 to 1.2. But it's actually very well located in terms of school zones, in terms of access, in terms of, I'd even say facilities too. Look, it only sits, literally neighbouring to Beaumaris, which has some very good school zones. It's only about 10 to 15 minutes from Brighton. It's close to Clayton, which is a major job precinct for both, white and blue collar jobs in Melbourne. And it's actually going to be a part of a thing called the Suburban Rail Loop in the future of Melbourne. So that's actually going to connect a lot of your outer east suburbs right around Melbourne to also the west. So Cheltenham's going to be one of the suburbs that's actually going to, I think from memory, it's actually going to be the terminus of the Suburban Rail Loop. Now, look, I'm not saying this project's going to be, completed in the next year or maybe even the next 3 years, because I just don't trust the Victorian government to get anything, because they're just a clown state in terms of politicians. But in terms of why they're putting this loop in, there is a really good reason for it. And the reason for that is because Cheltenham is actually well located and a lot of people actually go through there. So that's a reason they're making it a key station on this actual loop. So that's one thing. Look, in the suburb as well, you've got a lot of old sort of 60s and 70s really good brick homes on, your 550 to 700 square metre blocks. Solid as a rock, nothing goes wrong with them. The suburb's done above 9% for like 50 years or so. Look, it's done nothing for about, in my eyes, about 6 or 7 years. So look, of course, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go up immediately, but as I said, if you're buying for the minimum course of what you should buy for being 20 years, definitely consider Cheltenham because it's such a good suburb to buy in. So you're still picking up, for easily, I'd say, 1.1 million, a good home. So definitely consider that, especially if you want a good family suburb close to a good lifestyle precinct. Finally, look, an area I want to finally close off with, and I'm only going to give you kind of 1/2 suburbs in it, is the inner north of Melbourne. So look, it's an interesting area because obviously I'd say everyone's pick, or most people would say Brunswick's definitely your pick, or maybe somewhere like maybe Ivanhoe might be your pick. But both of them are good suburbs to buy in, don't get me wrong. But there's two suburbs that neighbour each other that I think are outstanding buys and so underpriced at the moment, and they are Heidelberg Heights and Heidelberg West. So a little bit about them is that they used to be very heavy public housing suburbs. Though what's happened now is most of that's been sold off in the early 2000s, and it's been bought by developers and completely redeveloped into either new townhouses or new luxury dwellings. So I got a photo here, and this is just off a local page, and this is local, should I say, townhouses that have been developed there. So if you go by Heidelberg Heights and Heidelberg West, you'll see a lot of dwellings like this be developed, and it's just going to continue to happen in the future. Now, the interesting thing about Heidelberg Heights and Heidelberg West is they're actually cheaper than all the suburbs that surround them. So Rosanna, Watsonia, Reservoir, and also Belfield and Ivanhoe are all significantly more expensive than Heidelberg Heights and Heidelberg West. So what's going to happen there is you'll have the spillover effect with people who cannot no longer afford in these suburbs, then get to move into these suburbs. And what's going to happen is it's going to completely gentrify these suburbs and therefore push prices up, but not only prices, but rents as well. And you're still picking up these for, exactly $750,000 range on fairly decent blocks. So for those with your minimum budget, as I previously discussed in Melbourne, consider Heidelberg Heights and Heidelberg West, particularly if you kind of like your green leafy neighbourhoods, because they are kind of up in that kind of range. And they're actually close to a lot of good schools too. So, Ivanhoe has quite a few good schools. Kew has a few good schools that only lie about 5 or 10 minutes away. So, definitely something to consider when looking at the inner north of Melbourne. We're getting to the end of this episode, but I'm actually going to go into a few more cities in the future. So I'm actually definitely going to go into Perth. I'm also going to go into probably Geelong and also Newcastle. And finally as well, I'm actually going to tell people how to invest in a recession. So stick around and keep an eye out for those episodes that come out every Sunday. Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and if you're looking for a buyer's agent in Australia's best performing suburbs, be sure to reach out via www.compoundinvest.com.au. Thanks again, and welcome to the channel. I'll see you on the next one.